We tend to think of death as the end, right? A final, absolute full stop. But what if it isn't? What if it's actually the start of a strange, new, and surprisingly active biological chapter? Today, we're diving into the idea of a genetic afterlife and what really happens to our bodies when we die. I mean, it's the ultimate question, isn't it? For thousands of years, we've tried to answer it with philosophy, with faith, but today we're going to look at it through the lens of genetics. And trust me, the answer is way more complex and honestly more fascinating than you probably imagine. So the common idea is that death is like flipping a light switch. 1 second you're on, the next, poof, you're off. But science tells a completely different story. It's not some abrupt stop. It's more like a gradual unwinding of a super complex system. So let's take a look at what that process actually looks like. To really get what's happening on a genetic level, we first have to just completely throw out this idea of death as a single instantaneous event. It's a process, not a moment. Okay, so as soon as the core functions of life stop, a whole new set of processes kicks into gear. The body begins this incredibly organized and complex journey of decomposition, of returning to its basic components. It's really just nature's ultimate recycling program. So let's start with what we can see, the stuff that's more familiar. The physical journey of the body after death has been mapped out in pretty fine detail by forensic scientists, and you might have heard of some of these stages before. Generally, a body goes through 5 main stages. It starts at fresh, then moves to bloat and active decay as all the microorganisms get to work, and finally, it ends in advanced decay and a skeletonized state. This is the visible, outward story of what's going on, but it is not the whole story. Not even close. And this is where things get really interesting. Because while the body is visibly breaking down on the outside, deep inside our cells, right in our very DNA, there's a wild flurry of activity. It's kind of like a genetic ghost in the machine. Yeah, so researchers studying the period right after death, they stumbled onto something completely unexpected. A dramatic spike in the activity of certain genes. So far from everything shutting down, parts of our genetic code were actually waking up. The scientists behind this have this really cool way of putting it. They call it a gradual disengagement. Think of it like this. It's like a complex society suddenly losing its central government. All the big national systems start to fail, but on a local level, emergency services and local authorities just flare up trying to respond to the chaos. Well, our genes seem to be doing something very, very similar. And the scale of this is just staggering. In one major study, researchers found that the messages from over 1,000 genes didn't just hang around after death. They actually became more abundant. Let that sink in. That's over 1,000 genes getting a new lease on life after life has officially ended. So how do they even measure this? Well, they study something called the postmortem transcriptome. The easiest way to think about it is like this. Your DNA is the master blueprint, and RNA is the work order that gets sent to the factory floor to build something. By looking at all the RNA, scientists can see which work orders are still being sent out after death, which tells them which genes are still active. And get this, it's not just a final flicker either. This activity happens in waves. There's an initial spike within the first half hour, then another, often bigger, peak at around 24 hours postmortem. And for some genes, this heightened activity can last for 48 hours, sometimes even longer. It's a dynamic, unfolding process. But here's where it gets truly wild. What are these genes? I mean, if this were all just random noise from a dying system, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. But the types of genes that switch on are incredibly specific and, frankly, a little bit shocking. So we see genes related to stress, immunity, and inflammation firing up. It's almost as if the cells are trying to mount a massive emergency response to the injury of death itself. And we also see genes for programmed cell death and transport trying to maintain some kind of order. But it's the other genes on this list that are the real head-scratcher. Incredibly, some of the genes that reactivate are developmental genes. These are the master architects, the genes that are only switched on when we're embryos. They build our bodies from the ground up, and then they're silenced, turned off for the rest of our lives. And yet, somehow, in death, they stir and switch back on. And as if that weren't strange enough, researchers also found an uptick in the activity of many genes we know are linked to cancer. These are genes that, in life, can cause uncontrolled cell growth. Seeing them reawaken after death just adds a whole other layer of mystery to all of this. Which, of course, brings us to the question that you're probably yelling at the screen right now. How? How can genes be active if the heart has stopped, the brain isn't functioning, and the organism is, for all intents and purposes, dead? Well, the answer has some pretty big implications. Yeah, understanding this whole postmortem show isn't just some scientific curiosity. This could have profound implications for everything from forensic science to cutting-edge medicine. Scientists basically had two main theories for what was going on. First, was it just an illusion? Maybe some RNA messages are just more durable, like a book printed on tougher paper, so they just last longer while others fall apart. Or was it active transcription? Was the factory still running, actively printing new work orders from the DNA blueprint, even after the boss had left the building? And the conclusion from the study was pretty clear. For the vast majority of these genes, it wasn't just a case of slow decay. The evidence points straight to active transcription. The cellular machinery is still chugging along, still reading the genetic blueprint, and still carrying out instructions. So what does this all mean in the real world? Well, for forensics, analyzing this genetic unwinding could give us a far more precise molecular clock to determine time of death. And for medicine, especially organ transplants, understanding which genes switch on in a harvested organ, that could be the key to improving transplant success. I mean, a donor heart might not be beating, but its genes are still very much active. The researchers have this beautiful phrase for it all. They call it the unwinding of the clock. It's such a perfect metaphor. It's not that the clock just stops ticking. Instead, it's like it starts to run backward or maybe sideways, disassembling itself piece by piece in this complex, genetically programmed dance. And that leaves us with one last, really provocative thought. If parts of our most fundamental biological code, our genes, carry on, working, responding for hours or even days after we're pronounced dead, what does that really mean for our definition of life? It suggests the line between being alive and being dead is a whole lot blurrier than we ever thought.